Hello and welcome to another Green Thumb program. My name is John Schaefer and I'm with the Harris County Public Library. We produce the Green Thumb show in conjunction with the Harris County Master Gardeners, but our show is for everyone in the Southeast Texas region, especially places like Brazoria County, which thanks to the Brazoria County Public Library for making their program available to their patrons as well on Facebook. So we are so glad to have everybody here. We are here online the third Tuesday of every month at 11 o'clock a.m. Today's topic is sustainable gardening. Learn sources and methods to promote biodiversity and a balanced ecosystem in your garden. But before I introduce our presenter, a couple of things. Number one, we love questions. Please type them into the chat on Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're watching this. We have Master Gardeners monitoring the chat, so we'll get you an answer right away, and hopefully we'll be able to get the presenter to answer your question before the end of the program. And second, our next show will be on Tuesday, May 20th. Some Like It Hot is what it's called, xeriscaping. And I am saying that correctly. I checked it out. Xeriscaping, Some Like It Hot. Grow and care for drought-tolerant plants and better manage our urban water resources. And now I am very excited to introduce our presenter. Miss Deborah Caldwell is a retired college instructor of biology and environmental science, so she knows what she's talking about. She volunteers as a Harris County Master Gardener, and she is a lifelong gardener with many years of experience growing ornamentals and vegetables. Deborah, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for the introduction.
Well, I am looking forward to it. And did I say xeriscaping correctly? I know that's
Yes.
Good. All right. Well, tell you what, I know we've got a lot to cover, so I don't want to spend too much time wasting people's time. But we'll be jumping in. I believe we have questions about halfway through that I will stop and check with you, and also we'll catch you at the end of the program as well. So, without further ado, I will let you take over.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to the Harris County Public Library for hosting us and for John's work. I also want to thank the people who are helping with this presentation, other Master Gardeners. And I want to thank all of you who are joining us today. So as John mentioned, we're going to be talking about how we can protect the earth with sustainable gardening. But before we get into that, I do want to mention a couple of things that Master Gardeners have coming up that might interest you. We do have a plant sale, the spring into summer sale, coming up at our Northwest location at HCC Katy campus. That's April 26th. And we'll also hold 2 plant sales in the fall, both at our Northwest campus and also the Southeast location at Genoa Friendship Garden. So we hope you'll join us. We have some great plants. John mentioned the next Green Thumb talk, Some Like It Hot, on xeriscaping, but we have several other really interesting topics coming up through the rest of the year. I'll be back in August to talk about plants of the Bible. So again, we hope you'll join us for those presentations. But let's talk a little bit about sustainable gardening. As you know, we're approaching our 55th anniversary of Earth Day on April 22nd. And it's a time when we celebrate the Earth, but we also think about some major environmental problems, including ozone depletion, acid deposition, climate change, air, water, soil pollution, and so on. When I taught environmental science, we covered many of these topics. And I had a student come to me once and he said, you should call this class Gloom and Doom 101. And I said, well, you have a point, because we are talking about some major problems. And it can be daunting. I think we can feel a sense of helplessness, especially as individuals. We feel that there's really nothing we can do because these problems are so huge. But I want to remind you that there's over 8 billion people on Earth right now. So if each of us do our part, we can have a big impact. Also, let's remember the words of Dr. Wangari Maathai, who said, "The future of the planet concerns all of us, and all of us should do what we can to protect it." So what we're going to be talking about is what you can do in your own little plot of ground in your own home to make a difference. Sustainable gardening is a way we can garden where we're trying to minimize our use of resources so that we're not borrowing resources from the future. We're trying to use methods that help to protect the earth. I like to think of it as living within our means, not overusing what we've been given. So some of the things that we'll talk about today include ways that we can increase biodiversity, conserve water and energy, nurture the soil, fertilize wisely, and also practice integrated pest management. It's shortened as IPM, but it's a method to reduce pesticide use. Now, when we talk about any garden, of course, one of the first things that we need to do is get outside and observe the conditions. How much sun is in an area? Is there a low spot that collects water? Do you have an area that has compacted soil? So those are some of the things that you might want to observe when you sit in your garden. And you may want to do this over a period of time because, of course, we have seasonal changes. A spot that is getting full sun right now might be shady during a different time of the year. But once you have a good idea about the conditions in your garden, then you can make a plan. And it could be quite simple. You might just take a plain sheet of paper and a pencil and kind of sketch out a plan. It can be a little more elaborate where you take measurements and you really note the different conditions. There are some programs online that you can use. So you can make your garden design as elaborate as you want. You can see a couple of resources that will help you. These are references that I found quite useful, especially if you're just starting with garden design. We have some master gardeners who are going to put these links in the chat so you can read them there, so that you don't have to frantically try to copy down URLs. So in general, what we advise is that you want to choose the right plant, put it in the right place where there are good conditions, and also plant it at the right time. If you follow this, you're probably going to have much greater success. So let's start with how do we choose plants? Now, if you're like me, you probably go to a nursery and wander around until you find a plant that appeals to you, and then you buy it and take it home and plunk it in the ground and hope for the best. Well, unfortunately, that often doesn't work. We want to try to find plants that will fit in the conditions that we have in our garden. For example, there's no point in heading to the plants in full sun if you have a very shady garden. You're going to want to choose plants that can tolerate the low lighting conditions. Here are a couple of great resources that will help you investigate and choose plants that should do well. The first one is the Texas Superstar Plants website. They have a list of about 90 plants ranging from tiny ground covers up through annuals and perennials, shrubs and trees. These are plants that thrive in our conditions. They like the heat and the cold and the drought and the torrential rains. They have been tested for many years and they've proven to like living in Texas. So if you go to this website, you can often find plants that will really thrive in your garden. A second great website is the Earthkind website, and I'll be mentioning this one several times. But one feature Earthkind has is called the Plant Selector. And it allows you to type in your zip code so you can find your region. And then you can type in the criteria for the kind of plant that you might want. So, for example, let's say you're searching for a shrub that is evergreen and blooms in the spring and is somewhat drought tolerant. So you can type in all of those characteristics, hit select, and the website will generate a list of plants that fit those criteria. They're also rated from 10 being the best down to 0 being the worst. So usually I will stick with the 9s and 10s to find the best plants for my garden. For both of these websites, when you click on the name of the plant, you will get much more information, photos, um, all sorts of information about how drought tolerant they are, what kind of soil conditions do they prefer, how much light do they need, and so on. So that should help you quite a bit in choosing plants that will do well. I have noticed that the Earthkind plant selector is undergoing some issues right now, so I hope the website will be able to fix those problems because it's a very useful one. Our website, Harris County Master Gardeners, also has many, many, many resources, everything from fruit and nut trees to different kinds of vegetables you can grow here and so on. We have a list of vegetables for Harris County, again, that have been trialed in our gardens and seem to do quite well in our conditions. So that fact sheet is available. And also on our website, we have the planting calendar, which gives you the best planting dates for vegetables in our area. So for peppers, for example, we typically start our seeds for peppers back in January, but now is a good time to plant them, starting in around mid-March after the last frost, really through April is prime time for planting peppers. So that goes back to our mantra of right plant, right place, right time. One of our goals in trying to garden sustainably is to increase biodiversity, meaning that we want to plant as many different species as possible and have a great variety of plants in our yard. And that in turn will attract a wide variety of different insects and birds and other kinds of wildlife. Um, so in particular, if you grow natives or other plants that are well adapted to our conditions, like the Texas superstars, they will tend to thrive. And in turn, you will tend to attract insects and wildlife that will be particularly adapted to use those plants. So other ways that you can increase biodiversity is just by planting plants of different heights, again, ranging from ground covers up through trees, different shapes, colors, scents, different bloom times, and so on. The more variety you have, the more variety of wildlife you'll have. Another thing that you can do is to do edible landscaping, mix the veggies in with the ornamentals, plant fruit trees. Fruit trees provide shade and color as well as fruit. So those are some different ways that you can really add biodiversity. Now, for pollinators in particular, there's several things that you can do to increase the kinds and numbers of pollinators that you have in your yard. One thing you want to keep in mind if you are trying to attract insect pollinators is to make sure you have food for different life stages. So, for example, you want to have food for larvae as well as for adults. And for many caterpillars in particular, you will find that they need to have very specific food sources, such as milkweed for the monarchs, for example. You also want to make sure there's a water source, shelter, and typically this is having shrubs or trees nearby where they can shelter and hide from predators. Well, the other thing that you want to do is to practice IPM. Again, that stands for Integrated Pest Management, where you're trying to reduce pesticide use. You don't want to kill the pollinators once you've attracted them. So one thing that you might consider is replacing your lawn with ornamentals, natives, as we mentioned, edible plants. And that will allow you not only to increase biodiversity, but you will also reduce your use of fossil fuels and your carbon emissions from your garden as well. You can also try to reduce your use of gas-powered tools. The typical lawn takes a great deal of maintenance often using gas-powered tools. It requires a lot of water and a lot of fertilizers. So you can have many, many positive environmental impacts by reducing the size of your lawn and replacing it with ornamentals and wildflowers. You can also use hand and electric tools. Now, let's be realistic. I'm not going to go out in mid-July when it's 110 degrees and use a hand-powered mower. Um, that would just be too much. But what I can do is to, over time, reduce the size of my lawn so I don't have to do as much mowing, blowing, and edging. Another thing that I wanted to mention is planting perennials. Now, perennials are the kinds of plants that will live for many years versus annuals that have, they go through their life cycle in just one season. Think about going to the nursery and buying plants. Those plants have been grown, often using a lot of fossil fuels. They've been transported, often across country, again, using a lot of fossil fuels, water, and so on. And then you buy them, plant them, and they, if you're growing annuals, they only live for a year. If you plant perennials instead, you will find that they live for years. So you're not repeating that process every single year. So these are just a few tips for helping to uh, both increase biodiversity, but also reduce your fossil fuel use and carbon emissions. Now let's turn to water because conserving water has become an issue here in Texas. I was looking at a map yesterday that showed extreme droughts in some parts of the state. Luckily, here in Harris County, it's not quite so bad. But if you look at the line graph, you'll see that the straight line going up is demand, and the dotted line going down is our supply. So even now, there is a gap between demand and supply, and it's only going to get worse in the future as we have more people. So it turns out that urban Texas is using about a quarter of their water supply for landscape irrigation, and most of that is being used to maintain turf grass. We have 3.5 million acres of turf grass here in Texas. So obviously, again, one way that you could reduce your water use is by reducing the amount of grass. The other problem is about 40 to 50% of our water is wasted. It lands on the street or the sidewalk, and much of it just runs off without ever reaching a plant. So back to the EarthKind website, they have a section on irrigation and conserving water. Among other things, you could choose more drought-tolerant plants. You can use mulch. You can check your irrigation system to make sure it's more efficient. The EarthKind website has instructions for doing an irrigation audit. So that's where you will put small containers in different spots on your lawn or in your landscape, run the irrigation system, and see how much water you actually collect. And you'll probably be surprised to find that your irrigation system is perhaps overwatering some areas while not giving other areas enough water. And then, of course, the idea is that you would adjust your irrigation system to make sure it's more efficient. Another thing that you may be surprised to learn is that there may be broken sprinkler heads or other problems. For many of us, we run our irrigation in the middle of the night, so we don't really know what's happening. So it's always a good idea, especially this time of year, to do a tune-up, check your irrigation system during the day, and then make any repairs that might be necessary in order to conserve water and also make sure your plants are getting what they need. Just as a basic rule of thumb, your lawn, your veggies, many of your ornamentals are only going to need about an inch of water per week. So that neighbor who waters every day is probably overwatering. Another idea that you could employ in trying to conserve water is to do what's called hydrozoning. And what you do is, again, this goes back to garden design, is to put plants that have the same water needs in the same area. So near your house, you might have plants that need a lot of water and a lot of attention. A little farther away, you might choose plants that don't need quite as much water. And then there might even be some areas in your garden where you don't have any plants at all. You have hardscape or you use mulch, or you could use that area for very drought tolerant plants. And you'll find over time this really reduces your water use. In addition, you might consider doing rainwater capture, either by having rain barrels or some other feature in your yard that helps to capture rainwater. Um, in the first photo, you can see two rain barrels that a friend of mine set up, and he was really surprised to discover how much water he could collect even during a drizzle. Just an inch of rain on 1,000 square foot roof will yield about 600 gallons of water, more than enough to fill those rain barrels. Another feature that you could include is a rain garden, a bioswale, a pond even. And these are best in low-lying areas of your yard that naturally collect rainwater. So the rainwater would tend to flow into them and then slowly percolate down into the soil and eventually to the groundwater. This gives you another opportunity to increase your biodiversity in your garden as well, because this would be a great place to plant some of those um, water-loving plants, plants that can take a little bit of wet soil, like Louisiana iris or something. Another thing that is recommended is that you really take a close look at creating practical turf areas. In the before picture, you can see the typical lawn sitting in front of the house. There's one shrub, so incredibly low biodiversity, but also pretty water-hungry landscape. That yard even looks like it's sloped, so I bet you a lot of that water ends up in the street. One particular problem area in many gardens is what's called the parking strip. Um, some neighborhoods have a thin ribbon of lawn in between the sidewalk and the street, and those are just about impossible to irrigate properly. The after picture shows a much greater biodiversity mixed with some hardscape, a much more interesting garden, much more beautiful garden. Now, we have to keep in mind that some HOAs, some neighborhoods have restrictions on what you can do, especially in your front yard. So you would need to make sure that you are following the guidelines that they require. But often you can perhaps still maintain a lawn, but reduce the size and include a lot more plants. That would be more interesting. So let me
Debbie,
stop there and see if we have some questions.
we do a couple of things. Yes, a lot of good stuff. I was thinking about that. In the neighborhood that I live in, we have sidewalks, which is great, and we do have that space that you're right, horrible, hard to irrigate because I end up watering the sidewalk more than or or the street or the sidewalk. I can't get that 30 inches of turf in there. But what I've noticed is that, and I don't know what the HOA rules are, but like mailboxes all sit in that space, and some people have really nice gardens around their mailbox or flowers or plants. And I thought, if you can do that, you can at least extend maybe an area around your mailbox could become a little bit larger and a little bit larger. That's a great idea. Okay, couple things you talked about. It sounds like a lot of it's like right plant, right place, right time, and I think it can be a little overwhelming, especially like when you look at these great pictures of here the before and after. I mean, like you think that looks like it would take years and years to get, but you can really start slow. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on like how to start, like how to have the patience, but yet how to like work on this over 4 5 years or 10 years, make it a
Mhm.
longer plan.
Well, you could always start with your garden design and perhaps put in some of the plants that might take longer to grow. Get started with the bigger shrubs or even trees, so you can get those in the ground and growing, and then slowly fill in around that. Um, Actually, it doesn't take that much time to make the change. You could have a garden looking like this by the next year. But the other issue, of course, is money because plants cost money. So again, you might want to take a slower, more gradual approach and purchase plants as you go along and as finances allow.
And you also, I think that's a great thought. And another thing you talked about was like the Texas natives, and it's almost like if people, a lot of people, they always want the exotic plants in their yards, and they want the really, the things that are going to be unique. Really, at this point, the Texas native plants are kind of exotics. I mean, you don't. I mean, they're native to us, obviously, but you don't see. You don't. How many yards do you see like in the after photo right there that you
Well, that's true. So one issue is educating the public about plants that are available that would love to live here. It's also one issue is making sure that people can find them in the nurseries. And I have noticed in particular that some of the nurseries now have special areas for their Texas superstars or for natives. So that helps. But also, we need to educate HOA boards and other regulatory bodies about the need to make this change.
Well, HOAs is another podcast. So, and one quick question: someone asked, "Are wasp pollinators?"
They can be. Of course, there's many different species of wasps, but some will help to pollinate. Sometimes kind of accidentally, because many wasps are predatory. So they may just, as they're going from one flower to the other looking for prey, they might carry a little pollen. But there are some that will help to carry pollen more purposefully.
I wish we had more bees in the yard, but it seems like wasps tend to be more of the.
Mm.
Great. Well, I'll let you know if we have any more questions, but we'll let you get back.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, let's move on then and talk about the soil because the soil literally is the foundation of our gardens, and it's so important in making sure that we have healthy plants. So, this is a big topic, and if you do want to learn more about soil, I did a Green Thumb talk on soil and the Soil Food Web a couple of years ago, and I believe it's still available on YouTube, so you could watch that. But in general, people sometimes don't really understand what soil is. It's really a whole ecosystem because it includes both the mineral component, which is about 45% of most soils, but it also includes about a quarter air, a quarter water, and that last little wedge is the organic matter, which is extremely important. So some soils are fairly deficient in organic matter. They might be way down to only about 0.5%, but a good rich soil might have as much as 5% or even more of organic matter. And that consists both of decomposed material as well as the living organisms that we find in a soil community. So here you can see some of the little critters that you might find in a good healthy soil. And I want to point out that the base of that food chain is the organic matter. So we often say that you should feed the soil and not the plant. If you're taking care of your soil, the soil organisms are going to take care of your plants. And some of the most important are the decomposers, the FBI, which consists of the fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates, things like worms and so on. Many of these organisms feed directly on the organic matter in the soil, the leaves and twigs and animal waste and so on. And then they in turn feed other organisms that are higher up in the food chain. So in a good healthy soil with a lot of organic matter, you're going to find an incredible biodiversity as well as just huge, huge numbers of these soil organisms. Now, let's make sure we understand some terminology. There's sort of a progression from mulch to compost to humus. Organic mulch is any material that comes from something that used to be alive. It could be leaves, it could be bark, shredded wood, pine needles. even animal manures. So an organic mulch is something that you're going to put on top of the surface of the soil, and it's very important because it covers the soil. It helps to protect those soil organisms. Now, if you are using an organic mulch, it will start to be decomposed by the FBI, and this process is called composting. By the time it gets completely decomposed, it's called humus, that wonderful, rich stuff that we find in the soil. This process is going to happen naturally. If you go to a forest, for example, you'll see on the top of the soil leaves and twigs and so on that would be acting as a mulch. It's going to start getting composted, work down into the soil, and then eventually it will be turned into humus. Mulch is so important because, as we mentioned, it covers the soil, it helps protect the microorganisms, it can control or prevent the growth of weeds, it helps to moderate soil temperature and retain moisture, it can help reduce erosion, it can keep the soil much fluffier, not as compact, and as we mentioned, if you're using a good organic mulch, as you see in the photo, it will eventually break down and help to add nutrients. You can also make your own compost. Compost happens. If you just had a pile of leaves in a corner of your yard, it would compost or decompose over time, but it would take quite a while. But you can make your own compost, speed up the process a little bit, and better yet, you're also removing that waste from the waste stream. If you look at the pie chart there, you can see there's several materials that we often throw away, including paper, yard trimmings, food scraps, and even wood that could be composted instead. So by composting, you're reducing your contribution to the waste stream, you're reducing the amount of fossil fuel used to cart stuff out of your yard and away to the landfill, you're reducing carbon emissions, and you're also helping to feed your soil microorganisms, improve soil structure, buffer pH, add nutrients to the soil, and also help to retain moisture and even reduce diseases and pests. So compost is a win-win-win-win. Now, it's fairly easy to make compost. As I said, if you just have that pile of leaves in your corner, it will break down. But if you're serious about composting, you probably want to speed up the process because you want as much compost as you can get to add to your yard. Typically, what we do is we build piles that are composed of browns and greens. Now, the browns help provide carbon, basically carbohydrate for all those little soil microorganisms. And it would tend to be drier material like dry grass clippings or paper, pine needles, leaves, twigs, those kinds of things. The greens are fresher materials like fresh grass clippings, kitchen waste, mostly fruits and veggies. You wouldn't want to include meats or fats. You could even add weeds as long as they don't have seeds or disease. Things like coffee grounds are considered to be greens. And to get exactly the right mixture is a little bit more complicated. There is a great website that I can recommend that will help you learn more about composting. We also have a Green Thumb Talk coming up, I think in October, on composting. So you can definitely learn more. But this is a way to get a lot of good, rich organic matter in your soil fairly quickly. And in addition to all the other benefits we mentioned, feeding those soil organisms, helping to provide nutrients to your plants, reducing your contribution to the waste stream, reducing your fossil fuel use and carbon footprint, it turns out that scientists are learning that soils are a great carbon sink. In other words, they can sequester or store as much as 10% of man-made emissions that contribute to climate change. So this is a great example of how one small thing that you're doing in your own garden has global implications. Now, we have mentioned nutrients, but let's dig in a little bit and talk more about those. Um, of course, plants need nutrients, especially the big three. NPK stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are considered to be macronutrients because plants need relatively larger amounts of these three. But they also need smaller amounts of micronutrients or even trace elements, um, calcium, iron, sulfur, those kinds of things. And it's interesting when I was at university in my soil science lab, we did experiments where we grew plants that had everything they needed except for maybe a trace element like iodine or something. And it was remarkable to see that they did not grow well. They were spindly and they often died because they needed just that tiny amount of the trace element. So when we think of nutrients, we often think of adding fertilizers. There are two basic kinds of fertilizers, two broad categories. The synthetic fertilizers are man-made, and they often come in a powder or granular form, and you need to mix them with water before you apply them. It's very important to read and follow directions precisely as to concentration and rate of application because these synthetic fertilizers can really deliver a punch and may burn your plants if you overuse them. The good news is synthetic fertilizers will deliver nutrients relatively quickly. Organic fertilizers, on the other hand, might be something like compost, um, manures, um, fish emulsion. Some fertilizers are made from seaweed, for example. And they tend to be a little bit more slow release. They release their nutrients over a longer period of time. So typically they won't burn plants. Um, and an added advantage of the organic fertilizers is that they will often help to feed soil microorganisms. But the big question is, how much fertilizer do you need? For example, I couldn't tell you how much potassium my soil has right now, or how much nitrogen it might need. So what we always suggest is that you get a soil test done. If you go to the soil testing lab website through Texas A&M, the website will give you instructions for taking samples of your soil, and they also have the form that you need to include. So you would probably use the urban and homeowners form and mail it off with your check and your soil sample. And usually within a couple of weeks, you will get your results. It will tell you whether or not your soil is deficient in nitrogen or it has enough potassium and so on. In addition, the soil test results will also give you advice about adding fertilizers. So let's say your soil is deficient in nitrogen. It will tell you how much nitrogen, how many pounds of nitrogen to add to 1,000 square feet. So you know exactly what you're doing. Now, you may think that these soil tests are awfully expensive, but in fact, the basic test is only $12. And I think the super duper test is somewhere around 50 some dollars. So really, this is a bargain. And in the long run, you'll probably save money by knowing what specific amendments and fertilizers you might actually need rather than just guessing. Now, as we said, you don't want to use too much fertilizer because not only is it bad for your plants, it's also bad for the environment because fertilizers don't stay put. They usually wash off into the storm drain and eventually reach bodies of water like lakes or the Gulf of Mexico. And they cause lots of problems there because they continue to act as fertilizers and increase the growth of algae, often to the point where the algae just chokes out everything. And as the algae dies and decomposes, it's being eaten by bacteria that use oxygen in the water. Well, without that oxygen, other organisms like fish start to die. So now you've made an even bigger problem because you have dead algae and dead fish, being eaten by the bacteria who use even more oxygen. So in the map, you can see some of the orange and even dark orange areas in the Gulf of Mexico that are especially hard hit by these excessive amounts of fertilizer. A lot of fertilizer comes from farms, certainly, but again, we can do our part by using fertilizers wisely in our own gardens. Another aspect of sustainable gardening is integrated pest management, or IPM. And our goal is to reduce pests, to kind of control pests, because we recognize that we probably will never get rid of them completely, but we want to kind of keep them down to a dull roar so that we are still getting our fruits and veggies and enjoying our gardens. The great thing about IPM is that it combines a whole toolbox full of methods, cultural, physical, biological, and yes, even chemical methods to try to control pests. We often talk about the IPM pyramid. At the base is prevention or cultural methods, and then we might need to move up to physical or mechanical methods, maybe biological methods. And then as we near the top, we might use things like insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils or other botanicals. And then at the very top of the pyramid are the synthetic chemical pesticides. Notice that as we go up the pyramid, we're increasing toxicity. So often we can start right at the bottom with prevention or cultural methods. So let's use our tomato hornworm here as an example. Tomato hornworms can decimate your tomato plants. So one thing you can do is prevent them from reaching your tomato plants by using row covers or some other barrier. You, of course, will do everything you can to make sure your tomato plants are thriving, healthy, vigorous plants, so they're less likely to be harmed by pests. But you may find that you still have a problem. So you might go up to physical or mechanical methods to deal with the tomato hornworm. So a physical method might be pruning your tomato plants so they're not quite as bushy, and that means that you'll be able to see the tomato hornworms more clearly, although they're very good at camouflaging themselves because they're exactly the same green as your tomato plants. But you could do a search, and if you do see them, you can physically pick them off the plant, drop them in a bucket of soapy water, cut them in two with your garden shears. I know that's kind of horrifying, but those would be physical or mechanical methods. Biological methods for dealing with hornworms and other caterpillars is to release predators of some sort, let the birds get at them, or often for caterpillars we use Bacillus thuringiensis. It's BT powder. It can be mixed with water and sprayed on your plants. And the BT is bacteria that will cause digestive upset and eventually kill the caterpillars. Well, let's say you've tried all these things. It hasn't worked. You still have tomato hornworms eating your tomatoes. You could move up the pyramid to insecticidal soaps or botanicals, maybe something like neem oil. And if all else fails, then you might have to go to the tip top of the pyramid and use a synthetic pesticide. But my guess is if you try these more benign methods, you may find that you've been able to eliminate the tomato hornworms or some other pests before you have to move up the pyramid. And the whole point is that we are trying to avoid the use of heavy-duty chemical pesticides because they not only harm the pests, but they also harm the other insects and wildlife that we've tried to attract to our gardens. Now, finally, I'd like to recommend that one way that you could reduce your use of fossil fuels in your carbon footprint is by growing your own edible plants, fruits, and veggies. And let's say, though, that you don't have a garden space. Even a few containers can make a difference. Having a little pot of herbs, for example, or a patio tomato means that you're not going to the store for those items. But another way that you can help grow plants is through community gardening. And they're becoming very, very popular here in Harris County and Brazoria County. Uh, Houston, I know, does a lot to encourage community gardens. And they're a great way to get involved. Grow your own veggies or grow veggies for a food pantry and really have an impact. I helped to start the Garden of Grace at my church, and we were able to eventually contribute to Katy Christian Ministries food pantry. It was such a great feeling to take over bags and bags of cabbages and other produce that we had grown. Here's some examples of some other community gardens in the Northwest. The Neighborhood Garden Project is on Franz Road at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and it's huge. Urban Harvest does a lot to help educate people about community gardens. If you have a community garden, you could become an affiliate with Urban Harvest. So these are all examples of community gardens that would probably love to have you volunteer if you wanted to help out. So let's see if we have any more questions at this point.
Yeah, so just making notes here. So good timing. Let's back up a little bit. Real quick on the community gardens, though, before we back up. If you don't happen to know one, or maybe your church doesn't do it, you can always start one, right? I mean, if we all
Right.
look around, there is, a space all around us. We're fortunate enough to live in a big county in Harris County, and the surrounding counties have lots of land, and uh, uh, I would just imagine that there's different ways, either talking to your local politicians or people who own the land might
Mhm.
welcome a chance. Like if you're willing to attend to a garden or plant a couple of trees on somebody's vacant lot, they might be a little more. So don't be afraid to do that, I would say.
Absolutely.
Um, Quite going back to you were talking about composting. I wanted
Mhm.
to get your the question came in. What are your thoughts on they have those dirt machines from food scraps. There's I won't say the brand names, but some can get kind of expensive. But I've heard my sister, who loves gadgets, swears by one. I don't know. When I heard it, it sounded kind of loud and annoying, and I wondered how long it ran. Your thoughts on those, as far as like practicality, or
Mhm.
is it worth it with electricity?
Well, they do a great job of breaking down food waste, and you can get what looks like a brown powder basically overnight. They are extremely expensive, so that would be one issue. What you get from them is technically not compost, but it is kind of a dried, roasted organic matter. And you could put that on your plants, or you could put it out in your garden, or you could add it to a regular compost pile. So I think my biggest issue is just the price.
Right. Yeah. Or you could just go have your own composting in the backyard and take all those things that you would be putting into the machine and put them in your compost.
Yes, but for somebody who lives in an apartment, it might be their only
That's
alternative.
true. That's true.
Yeah.
That's a good point. You talked about soil as a carbon sink. This is the first I'd not heard that. I wondered, and you spent a slide on it, but would you mind elaborating a little bit on that, as far as how that what how we can maybe increase that, or is there anything we can do to, or is it just a way of looking at soil?
Well, industrialized agriculture often doesn't put much back into the soil in terms of organic matter. And as a result, they often rely very heavily on fertilizers, and synthetic fertilizers specifically. But if we did add a lot more organic matter back into the soil, compost or other materials, um, it would have many benefits, including keeping that material in the soil for a period of time rather than releasing the carbon back into the air. So I've heard uh, numbers as high as 40% of
Wow.
the carbon going as out as a greenhouse gas emission could be stored in the soil. But that would take a huge effort and much more um, organic matter going back into the soil. It's doable, but it would
Right.
be quite a change.
The science of gardening fascinating. I mean, it blows me away how big it is. And it's the biology and the science, the chemistry as well. So, a question came in, and you actually then I think answered it later, but I wanted to kind of go over it again. Someone was asking why, why would you worry about organic fertilizer versus synthetic fertilizer if it wasn't for a food or an edible plant? But then, of course, you talked about it escaping into the waterways, and and how and I hadn't really thought about that, but obviously it's all runoff and could then fertilize
Mhm.
the algae in the ocean. But my question is this: so I noticed when the last time I was in the big box store, there's a lot of like really big name brand companies who mostly sell synthetic fertilizers of some sort, but then they actually have like there's that one organic. And your thoughts on? I mean, is it just my bias that I think if I'm going to buy organic, it's going to be a label that I don't recognize and a label that seems like it's locally, locally grown, or can the big companies actually deliver on their, or when they say organic, is it the same, or is there a difference?
The real difference between synthetic and organic fertilizers is the source, how it's made. Synthetic fertilizers are manufactured using chemicals. Organic fertilizers are derived from something that was alive once. So it might be manure, it might be um, something like fish. Um, that's really the only difference in terms of manufacturing it. And there are companies that have a big business of manufacturing or making organic fertilizers. Um, so, as I mentioned, the synthetic fertilizers are good at delivering nutrients very quickly. For the organic fertilizers, it usually takes a little longer for the nutrients to become available. Um, you need to recognize, though, that both will eventually run off and could potentially contribute to the problem of dead zones. So that's why it's wise to do the soil testing. Make sure you know what your soil actually needs and use the right amount, and that way you can minimize the excess that goes into the
Try not to
soil.
overuse the fertilizer. Try
Hmm.
to just use what you need to get the garden back to what it
Exactly.
needs to be, and
Yeah.
then that's the one, as opposed to thinking it in terms of it like an annual thing. You're going to be fertilizing with a chemical or synthetic. Get it fixed to where it needs to be, and then let the garden treat itself the way it should.
Another thing about using too much fertilizer is that it, of course, promotes a lot of fresh new growth, which is very attractive to pests. So you might create another problem. So try to fine tune your use of fertilizers.
Absolutely. Well, Deborah, that is all the questions we had. I didn't know if you had anything else you wanted to mention in your slides, or I think that we have. I think you mentioned earlier there was a. Did you know Friendship Gardens is there a sale coming up, or that you know of?
It's our most recent sale or current sale coming up is April 26th. It's going to be at our Northwest location on Colonial Parkway in Katy at the HCC Katy campus.
Got it.
So it's a kind of a spring into summer sale. So we'll have plants that can withstand the heat that's coming up.
Got
The
it.
other thing I would just mention is that I encourage everybody to go to the Harris County Master Gardener website, because we just have tons of resources. And we also have features like our Urban Dirt newsletter with a lot of good articles. We have the Ask Master Gardener online feature, so people can ask specific questions. Just an email comes to us. And we will research the question and send back an answer fairly
As I
quickly.
mentioned earlier, I can vouch for that. I did it recently. I had a
Yeah,
question about my tree, and I got a very specific and helpful answer. And I just put in the comment section the link to the Harris County Master Gardener resource.
great. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, Deborah, thank you so much. I can't wait. You said you're going to be back again in the fall with another topic. We looking forward.
In August, I'll talk about plants of the Bible.
Plants of the Bible. That will be very interesting. I look forward to that, as well as this one was. So, Deborah, thank you so much for your time, and to everybody out there, thank you for listening. We'll see you next month. All right. Bye bye.
Thank you.